Ellie, did you have a question there? I saw the hand went up, or was that a mistake? Must have been a mistake. Okay, welcome everyone. So this is another seminar as part of the Advanced Plant Growth Seminar Series, and we like to keep things diverse and mixed up. So today what we're talking about, we've got something that's slightly different from what our usual ones would be, but I think very, very relevant in terms of what the APGC and actually the James Hutton Institute Science wants to do. We've got Kate Hopper from the NFUS talking about the transition to a low carbon future for Scottish agriculture. Aiming for net zero underpins everything of what we do, and we've just gone through a long period of applying for the rolling Scottish SRP, the Strategic Research Programme, of which climate change and net zero is a thread running through all of it. So this will be relevant. Kate's come from an interesting background. She started off at doing time planning, I think it was, and then migrated into, did an MSc in climate change. And then from there, actually, did you do the MSc and then went straight to, then you were in Edinburgh Council, then you went into NFUS, I think, yeah?
No, I did my MSc whilst at Edinburgh Council. Recognised,
okay.
Around 10 years ago, it's recognised that we didn't have the kind of level of knowledge and experience at the time in the work that I was doing. So yeah, very nicely funded and supported by the City of Edinburgh Council to do my MSc.
That's a good way of supporting your staff.
It is, definitely.
Wholeheartedly support that, and we do that type of thing as well. So without further ado, and me eating up your time, Kate's going to talk to us, as I said, about transitioning to a low carbon future for Scottish agriculture. So Kate, the floor is yours.
Derek. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Yes, and my background is a land use planning and land use change and climate change mitigation, but it's very much also about community engagement. And we are an organisation of around 8,500 farmers across Scotland, and these farmers are going through a significant period and future period of change. So I think it's very important that when we talk about climate change, and I'm going to be very high level today in the way that I talk about it, is understood by our farmers and our members, because it's a complicated and difficult subject, and maybe some of what I talk about will touch on that today. I do have a presentation which will be helpful for the recording, so let's just make sure I can get this working again. And if someone could raise their hand or wave at me if you can either stop hearing me or the slides stop working or any technical gremlins get into the system, because these things can always happen.
We will do. Okay.
Yeah, so thank you. Okay, so I always start with this slide because I think it's really important to put farming in context, because we are one of the key industries in Scotland and across the UK and of course across the world in terms of food production. And in Scotland, we're responsible for around circa 60% of our food supply. We manage around 80% of Scotland's land, and we have a large total economic output of around 3.18 billion, and that was from 2009. But just a point to say that we have maintained stability during COVID-19, and whilst we had some supply chain issues at the start, we have actually maintained business as usual and production output. The sector also directly employs 67,000 people and supports a wider food sector, around 300,000 people in our supply chains and ongoing processing of our products. To be clear, agriculture is one of the economic sectors at most at risk around the world from climate change, and that also impacts our food security as well. But we're often blamed and a lot for climate change, and Derek and I were joking about this, about the reason why these guys, the cows. We all know that methane is one of the biggest sectors in terms of agriculture emissions, and our livestock farmers are to blame for the world's issues. And many of our farmers will have that weight on their shoulder at the moment as they talk about climate change. However, at the moment, our emissions stand at around 18% of the UK's total. This is brand new yesterday, and we went up, actually. It looks like we went up from 50 to 18%, but that was because there were some significant drops in other sectors due to COVID-19, such as transport. Agriculture actually saw its first fall in its total emissions in the last 5 years, which we've been pretty stagnant. And actually, that's a really good sign that things are starting to change. We dropped 0.1 of a megaton. It doesn't sound a lot, but it is in the scale of things. We're seeing drops right across the scale in terms of methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. And we're down to just 1 tonne of carbon dioxide a year coming out of the whole of Scottish agriculture, out of that £3.2 billion of investment that's going in. We have an interim target to reduce our carbon emissions to 5.3 megatons by 2032. That's a 30% reduction. But where does that come from? And I think that's probably a good starting point. And big question that our members always ask me is, aren't we part of the natural carbon, methane and nitrogen cycles? So why are we to blame for this? And yeah, of course they are. And we all know that. We produce our food using those cycles. This is a nice graph from the UK government, a diagram for the UK government produced as part of one of their consultations recently about carbon sequestration in particular. But it kind of shows the perfect scenario of what could be happening and what should really be happening in our natural environment as we use it to produce our food. However, another nice little image from the Soil Association, we're completely out of whack. Our natural cycles are no longer working the way they should do. We're not actually achieving those natural cycles, actually adding more and more to them, adding with increased methane, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. So we're completely out of whack. But how did we get there? Okay, so we all know that there's been a massive drive to reduce the price of food, a race to the bottom in terms of the supermarkets and how much we're actually charging people for food. Although at the moment we all may feel that food is incredibly expensive, it's actually an incredibly cheap part of our diet. We've also got a demand for high crop yields. That's not just food, but that's also for bioenergy and other energy crops. And even whiskey. Our biggest export in Scotland is whiskey. It's one of our biggest industries. So there's a big demand for producing grains for whiskey. We've moved away from what would have been our farmers' grandfathers' traditional rotation farming systems with animals used to fertilize fields and to maintain the soil carbon. And instead of that, we're using grain and soya to feed animals, and that's associated with deforestation worldwide. Too much stocking, so increasing demand has led to increased amount of slurry, which we can't do anything with. We've got too much of it and we have to store it instead of using it. And that's increasing the pollution, both in the application and the storage of the slurry itself. That's just livestock. But then arable also needs more fertilizer to keep up with demand. That means more nitrous oxide, more fossil fuels in its production. The whole system just cannot keep up. And I think it's being recognised now that we've got to change. That system can no longer work, and we're completely out of whack in terms of what we're doing. And the only way we're going to get to net zero is if we truly look at the system that we're working within. Let's see if I can move on. For some reason it's decided to stop moving. Okay, so this is a graph from 2018. It's the most recent data that we have. So you'll see that it's still showing that our megatons is 7.5 rather than 7.4, but this kind of analysis takes a long time for the Scottish Government to do. This was actually done last year, so we hope we may get more of this in the next few years. What this does is break down by sector of agriculture where those emissions are actually coming from. And you can see across the bottom that dairy, beef and suckler beef are the largest emissions, mostly to do with that methane, but also to do with that manure. But arable doesn't get away with it. Things like liming, fertilizer, machinery, there's a huge chunk there. And then sheep and pigs are, quite low down, but they do have an impact on the type of land use that we can have and things that we do with that. So this is really useful because what this is actually what the Scottish Government's agriculture inventory is starting to try and tackle. The funding and the sources of funding and the policy is what's been directed at dealing with all of these issues. What you don't see on here is the sequestration and the soil and the carbon management. This is purely identifying the impact of emissions. So the system change that the Scottish Government are looking at doing is moving from that conventional business as usual, system all out of whack problem that we've got. They've started to look at some nature-friendly improvements, investment. So this is things like fallow fields, some attempted nidification, ecological focus areas, looking at funding various different types of crops and things like that. But it's quite small scale, and it's being taken up by farmers at a quite small scale level. And it's almost a reluctance to do it. You may have seen some news press recently, particularly in the European Union, where the nature-friendly farming, which has been set aside with funding, has been brought back into use for crops. And it was certainly requested here by our members as well. So one of the problems is they don't see the value in it. Not all of the members see the value of it. The ones that are going so far down the chain, which I'll talk about next, do see the value, but many farmers don't see why this is working and the benefits of this nature-friendly process and the funding they're getting. The final stage at the moment is looking at going carbon neutral or reaching an emissions floor for agriculture businesses. So it's tackling all of those emissions under the carbon the inventory. So that is that truly a systems change, actually only getting to carbon neutral and dealing with the emissions? We don't think so, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. This is the only things that greenhouse gas inventory is actually tackling. As I say, it doesn't tackle carbon sequestration, it doesn't tackle soil management, it's really just tackling the problem rather than the system itself. Just a little step back and outwards. The IPCC report on mitigation produced this year had a lot in it about agriculture, and actually we thought it was very positive to do with, between all of the issues. It was actually a very positive report for agriculture as a sector. There was recognition that producing food will always produce emissions. That is something that we've been pushing for quite a long time. Food is a human right, and therefore that food production does have an impact on the planet. However, it also recognises the significant potential to balance those emissions with carbon sequestration. Again, to bring the inventory to a better place. So we're actually looking at what are we doing with our land rather than just tackling the problem. There's also recognition that the risk that climate change mitigation will impact on food production. So it's really important that we get the right mitigation in the right place, and that we're not doing something that causes carbon leakage or problems elsewhere by what we do here in Scotland. There's also recognition that the World Health Organization's term sustainable healthy diets includes sustainable produced meat and dairy, and that going to a purely vegan diet is not appropriate for every part of the world, and it needs to be locally targeted solutions to look at the issues. But it really does highlight what does change look like. So if we take all those things into place, that this is what the IPCC is telling us, so what do we do here in Scotland? Well, we need to reset Scottish agriculture for a start. And I'm going to talk a bit about research because I'm here talking to James Hutton Institute, and it's really important that we understand and work together in terms of what Scottish agriculture is going to need in the future. So firstly, that emissions baseline, that inventory. Statistics coming out of our farms are a nationwide average. They're not at farm level at present. We cannot compare ourselves across farms, across area, across sector, with any level of accuracy because they're nationwide statistics. The inventory doesn't measure carbon sequestration. It doesn't take into account any new methodologies. I'm not saying these methodologies are right or correct, but there's no opportunity to discuss new methodologies such as GWP star, which our members are very keen on because it looks at how the methane cycle works. It doesn't include life cycle analysis. We have an issue with scope 3 emissions of our supply chain and how they are looking at improving farming to deal with their own emissions reporting moving forward. And there is a significant role for an on-farm balance sheet, so balancing up emissions with sequestration. So we're not offsetting, we're actually just balancing out what we do as we produce our food. So there's quite a few bits and pieces in there which we can talk about in a bit more detail. And then on farm, as actually within the farm gate, how do we reduce emissions on farm? What's the best way of doing it? Where should we be putting our funding? Which sequestration methods work best and where? which system in terms of agroecological or regenerative systems is working best. Is there a toolkit, a toolbox of things that our farmers could be using for their individual farm? And then really getting down to detailed scientific methodologies about soil carbon sequestration, and actually how do we increase the quality of our soils and also the quality of our output as well. We also need to see reduced inputs in terms of how we use fertilizer, how we use feed types, and other areas include renewable energy such as green hydrogen and the balance between food production and energy crops. So all of those things we think could actually add up to a true systems change. And actually that's moving past that greenhouse gas inventory that we're currently targeting. We could call it agroecological, but it's really about farming and natural systems together and getting those back into the right cycles again, however difficult that's going to be. We need to move to an area where actually we are sequestering more carbon and having that recorded against farming, so farming can actually benefit from that as well. And then a nice little diagram again from the Soil Association, which is the other side of that. What happens if we can get these cycles back into a good system in the future? So you'll see things like less but better in terms of meat, healthy soils, fixing atmospheric nitrogen, and bringing back into a balanced system, which we think is very, very important. So just to kind of touch on some of the agriculture policy areas that we're currently working on, how do we get those systems changes to happen? What do we need? Well, of course, we're now post-EU. We have 4 devolved governments all now working on separate agriculture bills and policies and funding mechanisms. England have already come out with theirs. Scotland have put a pause on this to discuss it in quite significant detail. And Wales and Northern Ireland are about to produce their agriculture policies. All 4 unions work very, very closely together as a climate change team. We have regular conversations discussing policy because we are one small island and one small nation at the present time. So we are producing a new agriculture bill and policy and funding mechanism to support that. We expect that to be out by 2026. Those policies need to be practical. They need to deliver change which is achievable by farmers on the ground. Our farmers are small businesses. They're working morning to night on producing food. Any changes that they make need to be practical. They also need to be holistic, and they need to result in that systems change we've been talking about. So we need to cross over all areas of policy. They need to be properly funded. We still have a support system in Scotland, and we are looking at moving from a basic payment to payments which actually drive environmental change. But those changes need to be realistic. We still need to produce food, and I'll talk a bit more about a just transition later on. I'll always talk about a whole systems approach because we are talking about natural cycles here, and we're using those natural cycles to produce food. There's 3 key areas where we want a mechanism to work, and that's really about maintaining food production and viable businesses across Scotland. We are talking about biodiversity and climate change together. We think the 2 things go hand in hand. We're talking about land and an environment here. And we do want to reduce our greenhouse gases through a regenerative and sustainable farming system. The term regenerative is used by the Scottish Government, but that could be agroecological or any other term that we could use to describe a systems change to a low carbon farming system. So current issues, what's affecting policy changes in Scotland at the moment in terms of farming? The biggest one for us is land use change. Scottish Government policy one of the main ones to deal with climate change is to increase trees, restore peatlands and produce energy crops. But what this is doing is leading to a new and unregulated investment market in Scotland, and with a huge amount of land sales taking place, both for forestry and also for carbon credits. And most recent report from the Scottish Land Commission and also from various consultants looking at this issue has shown a significant rise in land values in Scotland for carbon, up to 60% rise. It's having a massive impact on the farming landscape. You're seeing farms and estates turning from agriculture or shooting, hunting and fishing, traditional industries in Scotland, to farming carbon credits. These carbon credits aren't staying in agriculture. They're often going for offsetting for large businesses, not just Scotland businesses, but outside of the UK as well. And the benefits and opportunities we're seeing are being lost to use that potential sequestration market to actually help agriculture achieve net zero. It's also meaning there's competition significantly between forestry and energy and food security. We don't have a lot of land suitable for producing food in Scotland apart from cows and sheep. So that land is going to trees instead of livestock production, which we still see as a key part of sustainable, healthy diets. Carbon leakage is a big issue for us. Significant land use change from food production to energy or carbon sequestration means that demand will pop up elsewhere. Around 98% of the UK still eats meat on a regular basis, and there's big concerns about how we can transition to a less but better system or sustainable healthy diets without significantly impacting on our consumption emissions and the fact that we will need to import food from elsewhere. And there's lots of questions out there about what's better to use the land in Scotland for, and no strategic plan at present or land use strategy that is looking at this issue in a lot of detail. So we've got quite a lot of concerns over land use change at the moment, and it's a big issue for our members. We're currently responding to the Scottish UK government's consultation on the emissions trading scheme, which is a call for evidence on this issue in particular, and our response will be out next week on that. The second point I've just talked about a little bit is about human diet. This is again one of the areas which farmers are struggling with at the moment. The move to a plant-based diet to save the planet is weighing heavy on many of our livestock producers. As I say, a significant proportion of the UK population still eats meat on a regular basis. And though we are moving slowly towards a plant-based diet, or at least a more balanced diet, there's concerns that a forced change in food choice will equal a fall in domestic production. And carbon leakage really doesn't solve the international climate change problem worldwide. And as I say, Scotland is best suited for livestock production. However, we need significant investment in supply chains to be able to support a less but better diet for Scotland. So if we were able to decarbonise our industry and encourage members of our population to buy locally, sustainably produced meat and vegetables from Scotland, we do not have the supply chain at the moment to support that. Potatoes are going down to Skelmersdale to be packaged. We don't have enough abattoirs. We don't have enough investment in what we call stainless steel. So how do we have that nuanced discussion about the future of sustainable healthy diets in Scotland moving forward, whilst ensuring a just transition for our farmers? And that's in the last point in terms of one of the biggest issues at the moment that we're facing. Our farmers are people. They're small businesses, they're family businesses, and they are businesses that are grown through succession. They produce our food, they produce a lot of the inputs to our supply chain, and have a massive part of things like whiskey, that we're the start of that food chain. Just transition, or those that you can remember back to the 1970s, comes from the coal industry back in when we moved out of coal mining in Scotland. And those that can remember back in terms of what happened then, just transition is essential. Moving any industry from one state to another needs to have fairness built into it. And we are very concerned that any change here is about shutting down our food production and importing poorer quality food. We have fantastic food and drink produced here in Scotland, and we really need to protect that and all of the people that work within that industry, which are mostly our rural areas and at times very cut off and deprived as well from access to infrastructure. We've got big concerns that rapid and significant land use change I talked about in terms of carbon sequestration methods wouldn't ensure a just transition, and that we really need to look at what we're doing in terms of the strategic planning. And yes, I'm a planner, but by strategic planning, I mean looking at how we're actually doing things, how we're regulating it, and the best way forward to what actually works. So how do we transition? A couple of key points that we really want to make. Domestic net zero targets should not be achieved at the expense of international environmental degradation. Carbon leakage is a really, really big issue for food production in Scotland. We will be increasing our reliance on imported food and products. We've got concerns about food security, particularly at the moment where we have all different impacts, such as obviously Brexit, COVID-19, conflict in Ukraine, and climate change itself starts to impact on the way that we produce food. Food security is becoming increasingly important worldwide. We don't want to increase our own consumption emissions just to make ourselves look good here in the UK. And we don't want to add to the environmental footprint of other countries. We're on one planet. We can't solve climate change by pushing it elsewhere. The second point is that farmers are a key part of the food system, but are also a big part of the solution. So we manage that 80% of Scotland's land. So farmers really need to be at the table in actually managing and dealing with it moving forward. And at times we're not, and we need to have a stronger voice. So just to kind of finishing up some key priorities for climate change in terms of my work moving forwards. I'm concerned about the assessment of our impact. I'm concerned about the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and the way it's reported annually and the accuracy of that. I think we should be increasing and improving our carbon auditing and the carbon auditing tools that we have. There's very little confidence amongst our members in the way that they work and the accuracy and transparency of those. We're also interested particularly in the methane cycle, and our members are very strongly interested in GWP Star, and as are other unions. And actually whether we're ruling it in or ruling it out is probably something that we're really keen on. We're really keen on what works best. We want to make sure that any subsidy or any budget that's allocated to Scottish farming moving forward is actually directed to environmental improvements and carbon sequestration that works. We don't want to be throwing money away and trying to change things that just don't work, although we do understand the need for time to test that. So we're very keen, our members are very keen to be involved in testing of scientific advancements. We want to see regulation of carbon trading alongside food production, and that's something that's going to be a very strong message coming out next week with the Emissions Trading Scheme consultation. And we want to make sure that a sustainable healthy diet for Scotland does include livestock as we move forward. And we want to ensure a just transition is happening, and we don't want to focus on small changes. We want a significant systems change that brings us back into that clean cycles that we used to be within, and bring ourselves back into a better nitrogen, carbon and methane cycle in Scotland. So just finally, what's currently happening and some next steps. The new agriculture policy is underway. This is looking at integrating environmental conditionality to at least half of all funding for farmers. They're targeting low carbon and biodiversity measures and emissions reductions, which is good to see, because at the moment we've been talking about the fact that the inventory for agriculture doesn't include land use change in terms of carbon sequestration. They're funding carbon audits, nutrient management plans and soil carbon testing, which we've been promoting to our members to ensure that take up, because we think it's essential to understand the baseline moving forward. And they're also looking at testing the targeted outcomes with circa 1,500 farmers to see what works. And in the long term, it's to move everybody to that low carbon sustainable future. But we're very keen on getting involved in what that future actually looks like. Lots of collaboration already happening. We chair now the Agriculture Reform Implementation Oversight Board, which is the team looking at future policy support with the Cabinet Secretary. I engage across all types of policy along with the rest of our policy team. We engage with our members really regularly. I am constantly travelling across Scotland, talking to members, trying to raise the understanding of climate change and the impacts on farm. I'm keen on promoting knowledge transfer and best practice and skills. We're about to launch the Scottish Government's Agriculture, Biodiversity and Climate Change Network, which is a network of farmers highlighting what they're doing and what works so that we can learn from each other. Farmers very much like to learn from other farmers rather than being told what to do. So this is very important that we get networks are developed to showcase really what is working and what farmers are doing well in Scotland. A lot of work going on with supply chains. We have Scott Food and Drink Net Zero Partnership, and we work across our sectors, and particularly in terms of dairy, with supply chain regenerative farming methods that the supply chain is looking at doing to deal with their scope 3 emissions. Skills education, the Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan, we're part of that, and we're about to step up on our skills work in terms of the climate emergency, because we think it's very important, not just for knowledge about even some of the terms that we talk about, but how actually do farmers achieve things on the ground. There's a big gap in knowledge. And then collaborating on research, and actually being involved as an organisation with research projects, with organisations across the farming sector and with partnerships with educational institutions such as yourself. It's really, really important that we start directing where research is required and is helpful to start helping really direct policy and make sure that we're starting to achieve our greenhouse gas emissions reductions and carbon sequestration. So I'm going to finish there and say any questions, and I'm going to stop sharing because I can just see myself and it's a bit strange. So let me just stop sharing that.
Thanks very much for that, Kate. My overriding thought was, who'd be a farmer, to be honest. It does rather seem like a thankless task at the moment.
Yeah.
But I think the only assured business is, as somebody once said, was producing food and being an undertaker, neither of which will go out of fashion.
Yeah, I'm concerned that food will.
So is there any, I've got plenty of questions, but it would be good to see some from the floor. Anyone got one? If not, Dave.
Derek, there's a question in the chat.
Oh, didn't see that. Sorry, my apologies.
I put the same question in the chat, but I'm happy to.
On you go, Dave.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I missed it when you showed the pie chart of emissions. I know that is emissions, and I know chickens don't burp, but but what about chicken? And last weekend I was up in a remote Scottish glen where deer were the main form of animal I saw, and I was wondering if their venison production at the opposite end, is it too small, or is that something that could in some way displace some of the cattle production? And yeah, what about chickens? Because I was told a while ago that was the cheapest form of meat, and farmers were rushing into it to make, because it was a way of guaranteeing some income at times when it's very hard to make money.
Chickens, yeah, the pig and poultry sector are two of our smallest sectors in Scotland. Neither of which produce methane, which obviously deer do, interestingly. I've been told, I'm not the expert on deer as a ruminant, but they do produce methane, so there is an issue there with that. Pigs and poultry, biggest issue with pigs and poultry is feed, because instead of methane being an issue, nitrous oxide and importing soya feed and deforestation is the biggest problem that we have with our with chicken production in the UK. Moving to a no soya or reduced soya feed in some way, or producing soya in the UK, producing new crops and types of crops, is all areas that we're really interested in. Because we do have concerns that at some point they seem to be getting away a little lightly at the moment, I must admit, chicken production, but they will get tackled, I'm sure, in the future once the focus on methane is probably lessened as we start finding some solution to it. But yeah, I love venison personally, as a meat product. I really enjoy it. It's not one for everybody, and it's not a big meat part of our meat supply. But yes, we do have a significant amount of venison and deer farming in Scotland, but it's not counted under the Scottish Government's inventory at the moment, which is really interesting. I'm not sure where it sits. I would need to investigate that a little bit more to see whether they're just getting away with it, and actually all that deer is causing all that problem without us really knowing about it.
So actually, the chicken scenario becomes interesting, because if we go back right to the start and you talked about the amount of slurry being produced, I've done a report on valorising waste, and also chatting to the guys from Beta Bugs and Entacycle the other week. Black soldier fly will happily eat slurry and manure to produce protein that can then go into chicken feed. Obviously, you've got to watch for closed loop sterilization and microbial and viral transfer, but potentially you've got an off-taker there that could boost that protein feed part. And of course, that can also feed the salmon industry as well. I think it's these combination of left field ideas that we need to be brought in. Any other questions, please? No? Liz? Nope, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, hi Kate, thank you. That was great. A lot of questions that we're asking. So to give you a bit of background, I'm a social scientist and my interests have been around local food growing, i.e. sort of allotments, hobby farmers, very small scale, but also household food insecurity. And I can see the logic of what you're saying, and I can see that, yes, moving to a sustainable diet and a sustainably produced diet, but how do we make sure that that's affordable for those on a budget? Can we, is there a role either for government subsidies of while we get used through this transition, or is there a role for different kinds of agriculture? So could we keep up with the intensive high carbon agriculture in some places if that is being offset by really like at Glensock, the climate positive farming?
Yeah.
So, you know, if not all farming looks the same or is the same or happens in the same way in different places, but we have a different types of farming in different places.
Yeah, there's a couple of things within there. I think the affordability of food is a huge issue. Really interestingly, I live really rurally here. I'm surrounded by farms, and my local farm produces brassicas and potatoes, and actually produces their own beef. The beef's not that cheap because it's high quality Limousin beef, which I choose to buy. But the vegetables from that farm, I couldn't even get them that cheap in Aldi. And it's incredibly good value in terms of what you're doing. I can walk up the road and pick up a box of veg, no packaging whatsoever, covered in mud, and it's pennies for me to buy that over winter, not so much over summer. So despite the fact normally people in rural areas with poor access to infrastructure, most people living in my little bit of West Fife have good access to cheap products in terms of food. One of the big problems that we have is where those costs arise. So the farmer will expect a price for their food. That then needs to be transported, it needs to be packaged, it needs to be processed, it needs to be then branded, it needs to be put in the supermarket, and the supermarket takes a profit, and then it pops out the other end, and it's had all those costs added to it. Now, discussions of supermarkets, and there's lots of political ongoing discussion in terms of what we should be paying for our food, and I'm not really one for getting into that discussion right now because it's a very big debate, but I think a fair price for food is really important, but we add so much into the process of what we do that adds cost, that actually if we could find a way of taking out those costs from it, and actually having that infrastructure in place in Scotland and trying reducing those costs, we could reduce the price of food overall for everybody. And that waste that we do in the middle of that, transporting potatoes from Aberdeen down to Skelmersdale, can actually start really helping to address some of the climate change problems as well. So there is definitely a life cycle or a supply chain need to look at things as well, and that's what the Scottish Food and Drink Net Zero Partnership are starting to look at, because there's whole areas within the food system that could be significantly improved, not just what the farmer is doing as the primary producer. But yeah, so, and also, what was the second part of that question?
It was different kinds of farming in different places, so you can keep on with your intensive high carbon farming in some areas and some places if you have intensively low carbon farming in others. Sorry, I'm not a farmer or an agriculturalist.
Just to say, I'm not a farmer, so my background is land use and climate, so it's making sure that when we talk to farmers, they understand it as much as I understand farming. So the one thing that we've really come to be aware of in terms of emissions coming out of agriculture as a sector, that is that the whole sector itself will never be net zero. We cannot get there without significant carbon sequestration. However, that doesn't mean that individual farm businesses can't reach net zero as a sector within that sector. So how we balance out individual businesses with the food production is probably a big discussion as part of that systems change you've been talking about, because many small farms, actually some of the bigger ones as well, particularly dairy farmers, are really starting to get close to net zero without the methane issue. And that methane issue is always going to hang around, because even with methane inhibitors, we can't get cows down to less than 30% without some more research into what we can do, or removing livestock as a whole. And that's not something that we obviously advocate for. So yeah, I think you're right, Liz. I think there's got to be a way of having a local solution to this, and there already needs to be a local solution to this, because most of our agriculture production here is livestock, so we're always going to have that problem of emissions.
Okay, thanks for that. So we're getting questions coming in now. So there's one from Alex Stewart who said, what do you think the on-the-ground changes are what you're going to see for farmers in the next 5 years? I mean, the land grabbing piece, do you think some of the farmers will go, oh, bugger it, just give up, move on? That's one extreme. Some of them may cash in, obviously. What's the gut feel?
Policy itself isn't going to change for the next few years. We've got a period of stability in the funding. So the farmers at the moment who are having issues are to do with the current situation with COVID, with mostly to do with COVID workers, Brexit, with costs going up, with the conflict in Ukraine, with fertilizer plants going out of business, and all of those things. So we are in a bit of a perfect storm with food production prices and how expensive it is to produce at the moment. But for some parts of our industry, they've never seen sale prices like it. The highest milk prices we've had in a very long time, wheat's massively through the roof, and they're actually making profit. So amongst all of the issues, we do have some farmers doing very well out of the situation, and they would never say they're not, because they're proud of being successful businesses, and they are businessmen at heart. In terms of the land grab, yes, we have seen some farms being sold, mainly when you have, because farmers are successive businesses, they are family businesses. Most of them will go to a family member, a son or a daughter, or partnership, rather than the big companies, which are PLCs. So you will see some family farms being sold off to kind of other buyers because of that. But I would say a large percentage of our members are very angry about the land grab, and are very reluctant to sell their farms, because they see it as their kind of heritage of Scotland and big heart of what the country is. So they're very angry about it now. So what's happening really is you got it's more the estates that are changing hands rather than family farms. So these are very large pieces of land, often owned by foreign buyers or investors from other countries. As you know, owner of ASOS owns most of Scotland now, and most of the wealthiest owner of Scotland. And these estates are looking at rewilding projects, looking at carbon sequestration projects, which on the heart of it are, as a climate change policy officer, if I was sitting anywhere outside of agriculture, I'd be going, wonderful, because we're getting carbon sequestration, we're getting biodiversity coming back, providing it's done in the right way. But from an agriculture point of view, you are losing agriculture and the traditional industries at the heart of what these estates did. And many of these estates are tenanted. So we have a problem in Scotland. We've got a huge proportion of our farmers don't own their farms. They're actually tenant farmers on these estates owned by large landowners. And we've got big concerns that these changes in land use is actually pushing tenant farmers off land. And it's stopping new entrants or young people, or not just young people, but people who wish to get into the food industry, coming in and actually getting a tenant farm to start off with and working with the states. I'm really trying to find areas where we are crossing over with regenerative agriculture, because one of the good things with some of the estates, particularly in the northeast, a couple of the big estates up there, are really starting to look at how livestock can be integrated with regenerative farming, and starting to look at how agriculture can be a part of rewilding and biodiversity and climate change. So there is a potential, if we can get into these estates and actually say, we want to be part of what you're doing. And it's really important that we join up with Scottish Land and Estates as the other organisation for members to try and keep agriculture as part of what they're doing, and show the benefits of how agriculture can really help with biodiversity and rewilding and all of those things as well. So it's probably one of the top issues, apart from food security and all of the input prices that we have from members at the moment. And we've had a big turnout on all of our seminars recently and consultations on this as an issue.
Okay, it kind of mirrors how the whole situation on property and the ability for early entrants to try and buy a house, and they're having to go to rent. There's kind of similarities in that story you see there. So we got one from Alessandro. I know the answer to this question, actually. It depends on where you are. So scientists often look for lots of data to deal with a given question. So you're talking about emissions and sequestration. What's your feel for the scope of farmers engaging with data collection on really big scales and collaborating with scientists? Are they up for it?
Yeah, the only problem is yes. So the answer is yes, and I think there's a huge opportunity. But one of the problems is that the systems and the ways of doing it they have at the moment is causing quite a lot of concern from our members. So carbon auditing tools, you probably know, got one big famous one in Scotland that everyone's heard of, but there's hundreds of them, and every single farm carbon audit tool produces a different result if you use them for each individual farm, and which means that our members are really, really concerned about accuracy. So there's big concerns about transparency, about accuracy, about how that is then translated into what they're being told to do. So there's a little bit of concern over it. They're less concerned about big data. There's a few members are, because like any cross section of the public, there's always going to be a few people who are concerned about the impact of them giving their data to somebody else. But really keen on soil carbon testing for a start. That's one area where they're really, because I think the big concern over loss of land to tree planting, when actually they think there's a potential for soil carbon to be as good or different in certain areas. So there's definitely areas where there's more positive views on it. I think carbon auditing needs to be significantly improved, and the tool that we have standardized and be more transparent, and a lot more understanding about what that means for an individual farmer. But without that kind of data, we can't really know exactly what's going on the ground. I have big concerns over the accuracy of the greenhouse gas inventory that we're kind of being hit over the head with every single year, because it's standardized at a national level. It's not anything to do with on farm, and we can't compare ourselves in any way internationally on the sustainability of what we do because of that lack of data. So yeah, there's lots of farmers out there. The national test programme, which has been funded by Scottish Government, it is starting to happen. But I mean, one of the big problems is timing and how much data, where do they get the data from, what do they need to do? They need their hands held. They're quite often shearing sheep rather than plugging in data into a computer program. That we've got internet problems in many of our farms, so there is issues with it. And I think whilst we're very keen to be involved, there's quite a few barriers to overcome before we can say, yeah, we're doing it. And at that point, it is still almost on quite a small scale, which is a shame, because I think we should be doing it much more widely.
I think this is actually a focus of a project we've got going on here, and actually a potential spin-out company to deal with exactly what you're talking about, getting hard data, proper data at very specific downscaled levels. My gut feel is carbon trading at the minute is the new Bitcoin. Nobody understands it. It feels like smoke and mirrors because it's a very hard thing to conceptually grasp. And my feeling is it will be finance industry that will win on this, because they understand these conceptual. It's a finance game. It's paper. You're moving paper money around a lot of the time.
And it's interesting that the UK government is consulting on including greenhouse gas removals as part of the emissions trading scheme, because at the moment they really just trade within themselves, and it would be making giving regulation to carbon trading within agriculture and land use, which isn't there at the moment.
Yeah.
And we would support regulation in that way, because it is Wild West.
Yeah.
And even though we do have voluntary codes such as the peatland carbon code and woodland carbon code, they're just not understandable to members. They just don't know what's happening, even however much we try to get them on training seminars to learn about it, or I go on them to try and learn about it. It's a black art. Yeah, it's a very, very difficult one to understand.
So unless there's any more questions, I've got one last one, and it was mainly to do with the shift in energy. I mean, energy costs have gone nuts. The ability to create energy on farms is actually promulgating out a lot more now. And my feel is that can really transform things. I mean, you're talking about, there's a lot of money being made in wheat at the moment, which I suspect we'll see a lot of farmers standing beside some big shiny combine harvesters at the Royal Highland Show this year. But is anyone going to be buying a hydrogen powered one? Is anyone going to be buying one with a battery charged one? Because your ability to charge on farm will be coming in not that long, I think.
Yeah, so one of the big areas that we are starting to look at, well, energy as a whole is on my remit, and there's a lot of, there's lots of traditional stuff that we talk about. One of the biggest ones, wind, onshore wind, and the ability of onshore wind to produce green hydrogen. So we've got 80% of the land. We've got a significant investment in wind, onshore wind infrastructure coming, and also investment in green hydrogen. So our members are, as you say, most of them are off grid or on oil. We've got very poor infrastructure in terms of the electricity grid, most of Scotland. And if there's any capacity, it's taken up by the big guys producing wind energy. So the small scale producers are really struggling. And most of our farmers, for example, I've got one of my members in East Lothian who produces fantastic flour, which I use for baking. And he uses the equivalent of one of my oil tanks a day. That's 1,000 litres of oil a day to run his flour mill. He's desperate to get off oil because not just the cost, but the environmental impact of what he is doing to produce his flour. He has been told that he wasn't allowed to put up a wind turbine and produce green hydrogen off it because he knows he can transfer his flour mill to green hydrogen very, very simply, but he's having massive problems. So green hydrogen, not just in tractors or battery power, but also as a potential for our land to produce green hydrogen for actually just for businesses and homes, but actually significantly upping and therefore reducing the price of production is a very, very key area for us. And actually SOAS, as the cooperatives are starting to lead a project looking at green hydrogen with Glenhore to look at that, exactly what can we do to promote agriculture or community scale green hydrogen moving forward with wind or on farm production, because we potentially could harness that really quite significantly and create a market for it. Yeah, so that's a huge area. And yeah, we've got farmers that have been advocating for green hydrogen chapters for years, but we've never really been able to get them completely off the ground. So yeah, that's definitely an area I'm interested in.
Taking gas from AD and converting as well, obviously.
Yes, yeah. So there's lots of other areas where we've got new technologies coming forward in renewables or waste processing, where we're really keen, because again, we are, along with, we've got some of our more rural remote islands, for example, Skye in particular, are trying to join farmers up with AD plants for the local hospital, so that they can produce a heat network moving forward out there. And so there's some good projects but they all just need support and help and funding to get themselves off the ground.
I mean, the interesting one's there, if you're farming at a tidal area, the trying to get funding for that is easy, because essentially if you've got these tidal energy ones, that basically they'll generate energy when the tide comes in, then it flips and generates energy when the tide goes out.
Mm-hmm.
From an insurance perspective, that's like gold, because if the tide's changed, farming's not going to be your worry. It's survival on Earth is going to be the worry. So it's quite interesting on how energy would be generated depending on where you are and how you farm.
Yeah.
So I can see energy being a dominant feature going forward for the next 20 years, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there's a new energy policy coming out this year, which we are very keen to see linked in with land use as well, not just about, gigawatts of generation and pumping that into the grid, but how does it work with land use? And it's that point of joining up the policies, because we really could benefit from it as a sector.
Okay, well, Kate, I think we've sweated you long enough, and you've survived all the questions, which is good. And hopefully everyone's enjoyed that talk. I found it really engaging. And if you'd like to show your appreciation in the normal manner, oh, I picked the wrong one, obviously. I don't know what that one does. We'll love that anyway.
Thanks to everybody. Thank you for the questions. And there was just one left in the chat about whiskey. And this is very much a political question about what should we be producing as a country. So Alex Stewart, who's asked that, it's a very interesting debate. And when I talk about agriculture, we don't just talk about food production, it's about grains as well. So yeah, I would love to know the answer to that one from anybody else who's interested in the future of what we grow in Scotland. But yeah, what do we grow and where and how do we grow it is going to be a big question moving forward.
Indeed. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Hope to see you at the next one. Thanks very much, Kate. I'm sure we'll meet again. I'll probably
Thanks,
see you at the
Derek.
Highland Show.
Yes, you will do. Pop into our tent and say hello.
I will do. Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.